In the 5th year of Tembun, 1536, in Gojo, Kyogoku, there lived a man named Ogiwara Shinojo. His wife had died recently, and his kimono was still stained with the tears that he cried for her. His heart still longed for her. It was the period of Obon, the festival of the dead, a time when the walls between the world of the living and dead grow thin. Ogiwara sat by his window, his grief unending, for this would be the first year that his wife's name was read in the Buddhist remembrances of the dead. As he heard the Buddhist sutras read for her, and saw children playing in the streets, he thought of the cruelness of life. He went home, alone, to the house where he would now live alone. And that night, in the remembrance of the dead, he sat on his porch. He stared into nothingness on his stoop, his mind blank. The night grew silent and still, but breaking the silence of the night, Ogiwara heard in the distance a distinct sound. Karong, karong, karong. It was the sound of wooden geta sandals walking upon the road. He heard two pairs, and even further in the distance he saw a small light appear. He knew it for what it was. It was a peony lantern, the kind of lanterns that people carried when they visited the graves of their families during the festival of Obon. The light grew clearer and more distinct, and he was able to see the figures who were carrying the light to accompany the sound of the geta sandals. Karong, karong, karong. The lantern was carried by a small servant girl, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, and walking next to her was her mistress, a woman of perhaps 20 years old, but profoundly beautiful. Her face was as still as the night, and Ogiwara could not help but stare upon it. The woman's eyes were vivid, the color of lotus blossoms. Her body was slender and moved with the grace of a willow. Her eyebrows were sharp as pine needles. Her hair was glamorously adorned. Ogiwara stared at her as she shined brighter than a moonbeam. Is this one of the daughters of heaven, come down to play? Or perhaps a mistress of the Dragon King emerged from her underwater palace? For there is no way a woman this beautiful could be one of us mere mortals. Ogiwara shuddered with delight as he looked upon her. He could not help himself. He stood on the stoop of his house and walked behind her. He only walked behind her but a few steps before she paused, turned around, and looked him in the face. And looking at him, she was even more beautiful than he could have imagined. She spoke. I came out here tonight with no appointment, with no hope of a secret meeting. It was only that the moon was beautiful, and I wished to admire it. But as I walked, the night grew late, and we find ourselves here in the dark. It is cold and weary. Would you walk with us? Hearing this, Ogiwara took a tentative step in her direction. Your way is far, and the night is dark. Perhaps returning home would be troublesome. My house is nearby. It's small, dilapidated, and certainly nothing that is suited to you, grand lady, but if you are tired, perhaps you could stop, and it would serve as light in the dark night, at least for a while, long enough to rest your weary feet, perhaps even to stop for the night. I see the warm light leaking out your windows. You seem as lonely as I do. I will take you up on your offer and stop with you for the night, for the human heart feels sympathy. With this response, Ogiwara was overjoyed. He He took her slender hand in his and brought her to his house. He brought out a bottle of his best sake that he had kept, not in hopes for such of an occasion, but in hopes of an occasion. They took turns pouring for each other. The moon sank into the night, which stretched into a most wonderful evening. With the approach of dawn, the woman, whose name was Otsuyu, told Ogiwara that she must leave. Ogiwara looked at her sadly until she said the words that he most desperately wanted to hear. "Why do you look so sad?" she said. "Do you think that this is an ending instead of a beginning? If you ask me, I will come every night. I will stay with you until the morning. Shall we make each other a pledge? Will you ask me?" Ogiwara was overjoyed, and he did ask her. And so as he asked her, and so as she pledged, she came. With the fall of night, Ogiwara would sit around on his porch, and he would listen to the still of the night, waiting to hear that sound that now meant that his love was approaching. Keron, karon, keron, karon. Always with Otsuyu was her servant, carrying the peone lantern. Always they came to Ogiwara's house. Always she went inside. And always she would only stay until the crack of dawn when she must depart. Ogiwara looked at her and said, "You have brought me so much happiness, but where do you go at dawn? Why must you leave? Are you some fairy tale princess that slips into the hollow of an oak or disappears onto the last beam shown by moonlight? You must catch your way home, lest dawn come and anger your father?" Otsuyu just laughed. "No. I know that you've thought me some grand lady, and in truth my family is descended from the Fujiwara clan, but the grand days are far behind us, and now I live in a hovel much more humble than your own. My siblings are all dead, my family is gone, and only my single maid is all that's left of the retinue. We live a simple life. In fact, we live on the alms of a nearby temple, Banshu Temple. It is far too humble for a samurai such as yourself to attend. Thus I will come to your house every night. Ogiwara, ask no more questions." Lying peacefully, Ogiwara was content, and he did not ask any more questions. And Otsuyu left with the dawn as she always did. Now, Ogiwara had a neighbor, and this was a neighbor who knew many things and was very wise and observant. And one thing that he couldn't help but notice was that his dour, sad neighbor Ogiwara had recently had a spring in his step, a smile on his face. He woke up every morning tired, but somehow much more rested than he ever had before. When the neighbor asked Ogiwara what had changed, Ogiwara would simply smile and say, "Nothing," and "everything," and then go about his business. Now, this neighbor was not content with this answer, and decided that he must know what was going on with his neighbor Ogiwara. And so, one night, he came to Ogiwara's house, and using a small implement from his garden, he poked a hole in one of Ogiwara's walls, and he sat there late at night to spy on his neighbor, and to see what possibly could be happening to make such a change in Ogiwara's circumstances. Now, that night when Otsuyu came, as she always came, and she entered Ogiwara's house as she always entered Ogiwara's house, but this time the neighbor was watching, and the neighbor gasped in horror as he saw Ogiwara embracing not a beautiful young lady, but a skeleton, a corpse, bits of bone, flesh, and hair hanging on them. And Ogiwara undid his own kimono, pulled the skeleton to his body, embraced the skeleton, smashed his lips against the rotting teeth, crushed it to his body, and rolled around on the floor in a semblance of bliss. The neighbor was horrified to watch Ogiwara contort with the skeleton. He knew that something terrible was going on. He fled in fear. But the next morning he came to Ogiwara, and he told him what he had seen. Ogiwara said, "No, you must have been mistaken. That was the woman I loved. That was Otsuyu who came to me every night. That was Otsuyu you saw me with." And the neighbor said, "No, Ogiwara, she is a dead and damned thing. And what you bring into your house is something evil. She is sucking your soul. As a dead thing, she needs a dead husband. She is killing you, Ogiwara. She is draining your soul's energy every night. She will keep coming until she brings you back to the grave from which she came." Ogiwara loved Otsuyu, but he was terrified. He went and he consulted with a neighboring Buddhist priest. The Buddhist priest came to him and said, "There's only one thing you can do to protect yourself." And bringing paper and ink and quill, he wrote hundreds of copies of Buddhist sutras, and he pasted them over Ogiwara's house. He made sure that every inch and every crack was covered. And he told Ogiwara, "So long as you are protected inside this house, she cannot enter. Now you must be strong. You must sit inside your house, and when she calls, you do not answer. Eventually, she will give up, unable to enter the house, and she will leave you." Now, Ogiwara did as he was told, because he understood now that Otsuyu was dead. She was a ghost, and he understood that loving her meant his own death. So he went into the house, and that night he awaited the familiar sound. And sure enough, that night the familiar sound came. Karong, korong, karong. He heard the Geta sandals approaching his house. He heard her approaching closer, and finally he heard her standing at his very doorstep. He heard her voice at last call out to him and say, "My love, Ogiwara, why have you done this? Why have you barred your doors against me? Don't you love me, Ogiwara? Have we not brought each other joy?" Otsuyu's calling were more than Ogiwara could possibly bear. He did love her. And so he reached up to the amulets that the priest had painted, to the Buddhist sutras, and looking over his door, he reached over and he grabbed one of them, and grabbing it, he slowly peeled the sutra off the door. Ogiwara looked on the face of Otsuyu. Tears streamed down her face as she said, "You have broken the pledge that we made to each other. Is your love so shallow? Does your promise mean nothing? For I tell you that my love has depth. From sundown to sunrise, I was yours, as promised. I came to you every night, as promised. Yes, I am dead, because when I died having never known love. It was the one thing that I wanted, the one thing I wanted to know. What was it like to love and be loved? And I found that with you, Ogiwara. We gave that to each other. I gave you a love that would never fade. That was the pledge I made to you. But you have built walls between us. And more terribly, you have built walls around your own heart. Take down your walls, Ogiwara. Let me in. Honor your pledge. Love me. And then he reached up and he peeled off another. And he opened the door and he let her in. The next day, Ogiwara's neighbor came to his house. He looked at the door and saw that it was open. He saw the sutras lying on the floor. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. And he saw his neighbor Ogiwara wrapped in the arms of a skeleton, holding her tightly in embrace, dead as she was dead. But on Ogiwara's face was a smile of absolute and complete happiness. And that is the tale of the Peony Lantern of Botandora.
こんばんは。妖怪文化研究家の河野純也です。こちらは私の研究室です。ご覧の通り、たくさんの妖怪たちがひしめいております。さて、日本の妖怪の中で最も有名なものの一つがこちら、六六尾です。普段は普通の人間と変わらないのですが、正体を表すと首がどこまでも伸びていく、そんな妖怪です。妖怪について調べていると、さまざまな国に似たような妖怪がいることがわかります。例えば中国の非当番、これは昼間は普通の人間として暮らしながら、夜になると耳が巨大化して頭だけが外れ、その耳を翼にして空中を自由に飛び回るという妖怪です。東南アジアに行くとペナンガランという妖怪がいます。これも同じように昼間は普通の人間として暮らしながら、夜になると頭だけが外れて自由に飛び回る。ペナンガランの頭には内臓がぶら下がっていて、その内臓が蛍のように光ると言われています。さて、この体から頭が外れて自由に飛び回るという妖怪、日本にも抜け首という妖怪がいます。日本人は昔から妖怪を絵で描くことを得意としてきました。抜け首を絵で描くとき、こちらに横になった体があって、こちらに体から外れて自由に飛び回る頭がある。これを絵で描いてしまうと、あたかも頭が外れて死んでしまった人間の絵に見えてしまう。なかなか頭が体から外れて自由に飛び回っているという躍動感を絵で描くことは難しいのです。そこで極めて漫画的な表現なんですが、頭が体から外れて自由に飛び回っている、 その軌跡を線で描いた絵師がいました。しかしこれ、頭と体が線でつながっているというこの絵、まるで首がどこまでも伸びているというふうに見えてしまう。一説によると、六六首はこの抜け首の絵が勘違いされたことによって生まれた妖怪であると言われています。さて、今晩は皆さんにその六六首にまつわる怪談を聞いていただこうと思います。しかしこれは昔話ではありません。私の友人が実際に体験した話です。私の友人、仮に名前をマリさんとしますが、彼女のご実家は先祖代々老舗旅館を営んでいます。その老舗旅館は長い歴史と、そして決して部外者には語られることがない、たくさんの怪談を持っている。例えば、一人で事務所で仕事をしていると、今はもう使われていない、誰もいないはずの部屋から内線電話がかかってくる。出てみると、という砂嵐のようなノイズ音がする。そんなことが何度も続くので、その部屋を調べてみると、なぜかそこには地獄への掛け軸が掲げられていた。これが原因だろうということで、その絵を片付けると怪異も止んだと言います。その他にも、見るたびに髪の毛が伸びる人形もあれば、夜中になると廊下では子供が走り回る足音を聞いたということもある。しかし、こういったさまざまな怪談は、マリさんとその家族にとって特に関心を持つべきことではなかった。この程度のことは怖いことでも特別なことでもない。彼女たちが先祖代々暮らしてきたこの旅館において、この程度の怪談は日常の出来事なのです。ところが、15年前のある日、ちょっとした事件が起こります。日本の旅館は春と秋の観光シーズンになるととても忙しくなります。その時期になると、たくさんの学生のアルバイトを募集してこれに対応します。15年前の秋、まだマリさんがこの老舗旅館で働いていた頃、その時も大勢のアルバイトを雇い、この忙しい時期に対応しようとしていました。そのアルバイトの中に一人、大学生の女性がいた。ある日、この女性がマリさんに奇妙な相談をした。
私だけにしか見えないのかもしれませんが、食堂の片隅に時々白い服を着た髪の長い女がいる。顔を伏せていて表情は一切わからない。じっとして動かないのですが、あれ何なんでしょう。
マリさんは、またかと思った。というのも、毎年大勢のアルバイトを雇うと、これと全く同じことを言う人が出てくる。マリさんは、まあ、毎年そういうこと言う人いるけれども、特に何かが起こるわけでもないから、気にしなくていいよ、と言った。この食堂の白い女を見てしまう従業員がもう一人いた。マリさんの先輩にあたる男性従業員です。彼も食堂で時々この白い女を見るのですが、旅館の仕事というのはとても忙しいので、そんなことに構っている暇がない。ということで、この秋もいつもの秋と同じように、従業員は皆、ただ忙しく毎日働いていました。ところがある夜、20時頃、宿泊しているお客さんの食事時間が終わり、その片付けを始める時間。その日、1階の食堂では、アルバイトの女性が 2階の宴会場では男性従業員がそれぞれ食事の片付けをしていた。他のアルバイトは皆休憩室で夕食をとっていた。マリさんは1階の事務所で一人事務仕事をしていた。通常、お客さんが各部屋でゆっくりとくつろぐこのとても静かな時間であるが、2階から激しい物音をさせて階段を降りてくる音がする。男性従業員がマリさんのいる事務室になだれ込んできた。今日はもうアルバイトを全員帰らせた方がいい。血相を変えてそう言う。
どうしたんですか？マリさんはいつも冷静なこの男性従業員の様子にとても驚いた。男性従業員が言うには、今、2階の宴会場で片付けをしていたら、背中に視線を感じて、振り返ったらそこに、いつも食堂にいる女、その女の頭だけが浮いていた。
ベテランの男性従業員が冷や汗を吹きながら話したその突拍子もない報告に、マリさんが呆然としていると内線電話がかかってきた。電話は1階の食堂で片付けをしていたはずのアルバイトの女性からだった。
マリさん、大変です。食堂の女の人。
頭がありません。この2人の話を組み合わせると、とても恐ろしい事実が浮かび上がってしまう。アルバイトの女性も事務室にやってきて、男性従業員と2人でパニックになっている。その様子を見てマリさんは生まれて初めて、自分が生まれ育ったこの旅館を恐ろしいと思った。怖い。でも、立場上詳細を聞かなくてはならない。でも怖い。しかし責任がある。怖い。マリさんは勇気を振り絞って2人に詳細を聞き出した。アルバイトの女性によると、あの人はいつも食堂の片隅でおとなしくしているんですが、さっきだけは頭がない状態で何かを探しながら食堂の中を歩き回っていました。男性従業員によると、あの女、いつも顔を伏せていて表情はわからないけれども、さっきだけは頭だけになって浮かびながら、俺の目を見て、満面の笑みを浮かべていたんだ。これはもうダメだ。ということで、マリさんはこの日入っていたアルバイト7人に早退の指示を出した。翌日、マリさんはお父さんに昨夜のことを伝えた。お父さんは笑いながら、それは困ったことになったなぁ、と言ったのですが、最後に、俺はそんなの見たことないけど、多分、それ、昔、うちに泊まりに来たお客さんだと思うよ。と言った。それ以降も、その白い女は、食堂の片隅に静かに立っているそうです。ちなみに、六六首のお話の中には、恋しい男性に一目会いたくて、首だけを伸ばして会いに行くというお話があります。
I'm going to tell you a story called Yuki Onna. It was collected by a person whose name was Koizumi Yakumo, also known as Lafcadio Hearn. A long time ago, there lived two woodcutters in a place called Musashi. Their names were Mokichi and Minokichi. Mosaku was an old man, and Minokichi was a young man. Let's call this young one Mino for short. Mino was Mosaku's apprentice, and he was still learning the trade. On a winter day, after working in the mountains, a big snowstorm came, and they could not go home. They looked around, found a little hut, and decided to spend the night there. It was a very, very cold night. They made fire in the hut so they could stay warm while sleeping. In the middle of the night, the icy cold air was blowing on young Mino's face and woke him up. She had long black hair and was wearing a white kimono, all white. She turned to Mosaku, the old woodcutter, and blew her white, icy cold breath onto his face. The old man immediately froze to death. Mino watched what happened to his mentor. He was so scared that he couldn't say a word. Next, the woman turned to him and bent over to blow on his face too, with her icy cold breath. But then she stared at his face, smiled slowly, and whispered to his ear, "Well, I was going to kill you, just like that old man. But, you are young and so good looking. I'll give you a chance. I'll save your life. You will not tell anyone about this, or I will kill you. Don't forget that." And then she rushed out into the wild snowstorm, leaving the door wide open. Mino never told anyone about this. A few years passed, and Mino met a woman called Oyuki, which means snow. She had black hair and a beautiful fair-skinned face. Soon, they fell in love and got married. They lived happily and had 10 children. But the strange thing was that Oyuki never looked a day older, even after having 10 babies. She still seemed very young, beautiful, and full of spirit. One evening, after putting all the children to bed, Mino and Oyuki were sitting in front of the fire. He said to her, "How odd. Looking at you like this reminds me of a strange night when I was 18 years old. That evening, I met a woman. It's uncanny how much she looked like you. Oh, it was a horrifying experience that gives me creeps even now when I think about it. It was so unreal. I wonder if I just dreamt it. Oh, was it? What if? As soon as he said this, Oyuki stood up and shouted, "The woman you saw was me. Didn't I tell you? Don't you remember?" I said, "If you told anyone about it, I will kill you." Oh, I would. I sure would. But now, how can I kill you after having all these children I love so much? Who would take care of them? So, I will give you one more chance. Please raise them the best way you can. If you promise that, I will save your life. Now, listen carefully again. Do not make our children unhappy, or I will come after you. And kill you for sure. After she said this, her body suddenly became ghost-like and disappeared up the chimney into the evening sky. He kept his promise and faithfully raised the children with all his heart. Nobody has ever seen Okikyu again, but Mino knew that under his roof there was a sharp, big icicle that formed in the same spot every winter.
はじめまして、文様作家、怪談収集家のアプス修正です。今回私が話させていただく怪談というのはですね、日本の海に現れる妖怪、海坊主にまつわる怪談なんです。実際この怪談というのは体験者の方がいる怪談になっており、妖怪というものの存在、現代では語られることが少なくなった中、非常に貴重な怪談なので、皆様楽しんでいただけたらなと思います。よろしくお願いします。この体験をされたのはリサさんという女性の方。日本の東京で IT 企業に勤めているんですけども、忙しい仕事の中、頑張った自分のご褒美として1週間ほど休暇をいただいたんですね。リサさん、非常にアクティブな女性で、一人でキャンプに行ったりするような、そういった旅行を好まれていまして、 この休暇に選んだのが瀬戸内海にある無人島。誰も住んでないこの島、4日間ほど一人でキャンプをしてみようと思ったそうなんです。瀬戸内海の数ある島の中、人が住んでいない島いくつかあるんですね。岡山に住む漁師の友人に頼んで船を出してもらい、その無人島まで行く。一周するのに2時間もあれば住むこの小さな島、海沿いのところにキャンプすることにしたそうなんですけども、持ってきた食料品を調理しているうちに夜も随分と更けてきて、テントの中に入って小さな明かりをつけながら本を読んでたそうなんです。そろそろ寝ようと思って明かりを消そうとしたとき、ザザザザザザ、テントの外、海岸のとこから足音が聞こえてきたんです。誰もいないはずのこの島、人の足音がするわけがないんですよ。その足音を今自分がいるテントに向かってきているのがわかる。ザザザザ。リサさん怖くなってテントの中、体を小さく、近づいてくる足音を、どうか離れてください、どうか離れてください、あっち行ってあっち行ってと。しかし足音はどんどん近づいてきて、自分のテントの前でピタッと止まる。小さなテントなんですけど、そのテントの上部のところ、ぐーっと何かが押し込まれたかのようにへこんでくる。テントの中の小さな明かりに照らされて、そのへこみを見てみると、そのへこんでる部分、まるで人の顔なんですけども、その顔というのが妙に落ち込んでて、まるで骸骨、それがぐーっとテントを覗き込んでるかのように落ち込んでたそうなんです。リサさん、その顔をじーっと見つめたまま動けなくなってしまったんです。どれぐらい時間が経ったかわからないんですけど、その顔をぐーっと上がっていって、またザザザザと足音が聞こえて、テントから離れていくのが分かったんです。急いで携帯電話を取り出して、この島に連れてきてくれた友達に連絡したそうなんです。自分が見たものを説明するんですけども、この時間帯もう船を出すことができない、迎えに行くことはできないから朝まで我慢してくれと言われて、震えながら朝までその場で過ごしたんです。迎えに来てくれた友達に見たものを説明すると、あまり良くないものかもしれないから、こういった港町ではそういったものを見てしまったときはお寺の方に相談する決まりがある。馴染みのお寺さん連れてくから、そこで話をしてみよう。港に着いてすぐ お寺に連れてってもらって、リサさん、自分が見たものに存在のことを話したんですって。話を聞いたこのお寺のご住職の方、こう言ったそうなんですね。あんたが見たのはね、それ瀬戸内海産の海坊主だよ。瀬戸内海産。どうやら妖怪にも何々産といったように地域によってその貝の存在っていうのが変わるそうで、この海坊主、瀬戸内海産の海坊主っていうのは話を聞くと普通に人のように話しかけたり、まるで生きている人かのように存在が見えるそうなんです。この無人島というのがですね、釣り人に人気で時々釣り行く人がいるんですけども、そういった人たちがこの瀬戸内海産の海坊主を目撃するそうなんですけども、生きている人かのように話しかけてくる。今日の天気どうですか。釣り人たちはふっと振り向かって見てみると、その異様な姿にびっくりするんですって。見た目は人のような形なんですけども、手足が妙に長いんですって。今日のお天気はいいですか。今日は魚は釣れますか。そんなことを聞いてくるんですけども、返事をしてはいけない。返事をしてしまうと妙に海に入りたくなって、そのまま帰ってこなくなるそうなんです。海に誘い込む海坊主、きっとリサさんが見たのもそういった貝の類なんでしょう。あんた、返事しなくてよかったね。目合わせなくてよかったね。ただ一回会ってしまったから、あんた見入られてるから、もうあの島には近づかない方がいいよと、そう言われたそうです。日本各地さまざまな怪異が語られる中、現代においても妖怪のお話というのはあります。姿を変え、さまざまなお話の中に語られるこの妖怪、今なお日本に息づいている存在、皆様楽しんでいただけてましたでしょうか。ありがとうございます。
This is a story called Mujina. It comes from Japanese folklore and was written down over 100 years ago by the great Irish-American Japanese writer Lafcadio Hearn, also known as Koizumi Yakumo. Mujina. On the Akasaka Road in Tokyo, there's a slope called Ki no Kunizaka, which means the slope of the province of Ki. I do not know why it is called the slope of the province of Ki. On one side of the slope, you see an ancient moat, deep and very wide, with high green banks rising up to some place of gardens. And on the other side of the road extend the long and lofty walls of an imperial palace. Before the era of street lamps and jinrikshas, this neighborhood was very lonesome after dark, and belated pedestrians would go miles out of their way rather than mount the Ki no Kunizaka alone after sunset. All because of a Mujina that used to walk there. The last man who saw the Mujina was an old merchant of the Kyobashi quarter who died about 30 years ago. This is the story as he told it. One night, at a late hour, he was hurrying up the Ki no Kunizaka when he perceived a woman crouching by the moat, all alone and weeping bitterly. Fearing that she intended to drown herself, he stopped to offer her any assistance or consolation in his power. She appeared to be a slight and graceful person, handsomely dressed, and her hair was arranged like that of a young girl of a good family. "Ojochu," he exclaimed, approaching her. "Ojochu, do not cry like that. Tell me what the trouble is, and if there be any way to help you, I shall be glad to help you." He really meant what he said, for he was a very kind man. But she continued to weep, hiding her face from him with one of her long sleeves. "Ojochu," he said again, as gently as he could, "please, please listen to me. This is no place for a young lady at night. Do not cry, I implore you. Only tell me how I may be of some help to you." Slowly, she rose up, but turned her back to him and continued to moan and sob behind her sleeve. He laid his hand lightly upon her shoulder and pleaded, "Ojochu, Ojochu, Ojochu, listen to me just for one little moment. Ojochu, Ojochu." Then that Ojochu turned around and dropped her sleeve and stroked her face with her hand. And the man saw that she had no eyes or nose or mouth, and he screamed and ran away. Up Ki no Kunizaka he ran, and all was black and empty before him. On and on he ran, never daring to look back. And at last he saw a lantern so far away that it looked like a gleam of a firefly, and he made for it. It proved to be only the lantern of an itinerant soba seller who sat down his stand by the roadside. But any light and any human companionship was good after that experience, and he flung himself down at the feet of the soba seller, crying out, "Ah, ah, ah." "Kore, kore," roughly exclaimed the soba man. "Here, what is the matter with you? Anybody hurt you?" "No, nobody hurt me," panted the other. "Only, ah." "Only scared you?" queried the peddler unsympathetically. "Robbers?" "Not robbers, not robbers," gasped the terrified man. I saw a woman by the moat, and she showed me, I cannot tell you what she showed me." "Hey, was it anything like this that she showed you?" cried the soba man, stroking his own face, which therewith became like unto an egg, and simultaneously the light went out.